The Greek traveller Pausanias once described a famous painting that decorated the Stoa Poikile in the Athenian Agora, a work created not long after the Persian Wars. Among the many figures shown in this great scene of the Battle of Marathon were gods, heroes, and mortal leaders. The painting included the hero Marathon himself, the legendary King Theseus, rising from the earth, and the divine figures Athena and Heracles. According to local tradition, the people of Marathon believed they were the first among the Greeks to honour Heracles as a god. The Athenian commanders were also represented, including Callimachus, who served as polemarch, and Miltiades, one of the generals who led the army. Yet among these famous figures appeared a far more mysterious character, a rustic hero named Echetus, whose story remained deeply rooted in local tradition. Later descriptions of the plain of Marathon provide more detail about this unusual figure. The inhabitants honoured the fallen warriors of the battle as heroes, and maintained cults for Marathon and Heracles. They told a remarkable story about a man who appeared during the fighting, dressed like a simple farmer. Armed only with a plough, he struck down many of the Persian soldiers. When the battle ended, he vanished without explanation. The Athenians later consulted the oracle at Delphi to learn who this stranger had been. The response was brief but decisive. The unknown warrior was to be honoured as a hero under the name Echetus. Stories of supernatural assistance in Greek warfare were not unusual. Greek tradition often described moments when heroes or gods intervened in battle to support their people. Before the naval battle of Salamis, legendary heroes associated with Aegina were believed to have appeared beside the Greek fleet as armed warriors offering protection. At the same time, a sacred serpent connected with Salamis was said to have been seen moving among the ships, a sign of divine presence. On another occasion before the same battle, witnesses described a rising cloud of dust, accompanied by sacred cries moving across the landscape toward the Greek camp. A powerful omen interpreted as proof that divine forces stood with the defenders and that the enemy faced destruction. In many such traditions, the heroes who came to the aid of the living usually had strong ties to the land or the community they protected. Some were ancient founders or legendary ancestors, closely linked with a particular place. Others were summoned from distant sanctuaries when danger threatened. Gods could also assist from afar, and some accounts describe distant deities intervening without physically appearing. Even so, local divinities and heroes were often believed to be the most effective protectors, since their power was thought to be rooted in the land itself. At Marathon, both Marathon and Heracles had long-standing local cults, and the Athenians had even camped near a sanctuary of Heracles before the battle. Games were celebrated in his honour on the plain. Athena and Theseus represented the wider identity of Athens, and traditions existed describing Theseus himself fighting for the Athenians in that same struggle. Other Greek cities told similar stories of protective heroes who appeared in times of danger, sometimes described as towering warriors who drove away invaders and defended sacred places. Against this background, Echetus stands out as an unusual figure. Unlike many heroic defenders, he wasn't widely known before the battle and does not appear to have had an established cult at the time. His name also seems unusual for a warrior hero. Rather than suggesting a noble lineage or divine ancestry, it refers directly to farming equipment and means something like the man of the plough handle. For this reason, later scholars often doubted the traditional story and argued that it was created afterward to explain an obscure local cult, or a forgotten name. Some believed that Echetus may have originally been an agricultural hero, similar to rustic, protective figures known in other Greek regions. Yet even if the cult developed later, the tradition that the hero first became known during the battle may still preserve an authentic memory. No clear representation of Echetus survives in Greek art. However, a number of Etruscan funerary urns depict a warrior fighting with a plough, suggesting the existence of similar rural warrior figures in other parts of the ancient Mediterranean. These images probably do not represent the Athenian hero directly, but they reveal that the idea of a rustic defender armed with farming tools was not unique. Such figures seem to combine the identity of farmer and warrior, reflecting the reality of agricultural communities whose survival depended on both cultivation and defense. The key to understanding Echetus lies in the object he carried into battle. His name refers not to the plough as a whole, but specifically to the handle used to guide it through the soil. This wooden handle allowed the farmer to control the depth and direction of the furrow, and firm pressure on it produced a deep and effective cut in the earth. Because of this practical function, the plough handle symbolized the act of cultivation itself. It represented the moment when human effort and the fertility of the land came together to produce life-sustaining crops. In agricultural societies, ploughing was surrounded by ritual and tradition. The beginning of ploughing and sowing was especially important, and ceremonies were often performed before the first furrow was cut. In Greece, these activities were closely connected, since ploughing and sowing usually took place at the same time. Even in later periods, farmers preserved customs that emphasized the sacred nature of these first acts. The earliest plough ever used with oxen was said to have been dedicated to Athena and preserved as a sacred object. Elsewhere in the ancient world, similar practices existed. The tools used for the first furrow might be purified with water or preserved in sacred places in order to protect the fields and ensure a successful harvest. In Athens, the agricultural year included several official ploughing ceremonies, performed for the benefit of the entire community. These rituals were conducted in different sacred locations and were intended to secure divine favour for the crops of Attica. The ceremonies emphasized the importance of proper ploughing and the cooperation between human labour and divine blessing. Families who claimed descent from the first ploughmen played important roles in these rites, maintaining traditions that reached back into legendary time. The purpose of these ceremonies was to ensure that the land would yield abundantly and that the community would prosper. These public rituals were closely connected with other agricultural festivals. Some ceremonies were held before ploughing began, while others took place at the time of sowing. Together, they formed a continuous cycle that followed the growth of the crops from planting to harvest. Ritual objects preserved from earlier seasons were sometimes mixed with the seed before planting, symbolizing the renewal of fertility. Offerings and prayers asked for peace, prosperity, and the successful growth of grain and livestock. In some regions, animals dedicated at the beginning of the agricultural year were kept until harvest, when they were sacrificed in thanksgiving. The great state ceremonies reflected practices that individual farmers carried out on a smaller scale. Before beginning their seasonal work, farmers prayed for protection and success. The start of ploughing was considered a moment of special importance, when the success of the entire agricultural cycle seemed to hang in the balance. Farmers asked the gods to bless the soil and make the grain grow strong and heavy. These simple acts of devotion mirrored the elaborate ceremonies performed by cities and sanctuaries. Ancient poetry preserves a vivid image of the farmer at the beginning of his work. As he prepares to drive the oxen forward, he grasps the top of the plough handle and calls upon the powers of the earth to bless the coming harvest. In this moment, the plough handle becomes the focus of attention. The farmer's hands rest upon the tool that will open the soil and begin the process of growth. Through this gesture, he symbolically invites divine assistance, asking the unseen powers of the land to guide his work and ensure its success. The act of touching the tool itself carried meaning, since physical contact with sacred objects was widely believed to strengthen prayers and rituals. In this simple scene, the everyday labour of agriculture becomes inseparable from the sacred forces believed to sustain human life. In the stories told about the Battle of Marathon, the hero Echetus appears in the full manner of a warrior, lifting and swinging an entire plough as a weapon against the invading Persians. Yet the deeper roots of this figure lie not in warfare, but in farming life. His origin is closely connected to the moment when a farmer takes hold of the plough handle at the start of ploughing and speaks a prayer for a good harvest. From this simple act may have grown the image of a spirit or protective presence connected with the work of the fields. Echetus may have begun as a humble supernatural figure, imagined to hear such prayers and receive modest offerings made in the countryside. Even long after antiquity, traces of similar beliefs survived in rural traditions, suggesting that ancient farmers often imagined unseen forces sharing in their labour. It is possible that this rustic figure eventually gained a modest local cult. Private agricultural rites existed in which farmers offered prayers and small sacrifices before beginning their work. And by the 4th century, local calendars from the Marathon region show that even minor heroes received offerings on specific festival days. Some of these local figures were honoured with animal sacrifices and seasonal rituals. As ceremonies became more elaborate over time, attention gradually shifted away from the plough itself toward the festivals and rites surrounding agricultural life. Echetus appears to belong to an earlier stage, when the symbolic importance of the plough handle itself still held central meaning. The tradition that Echetus received, recognition only after the Battle of Marathon, may therefore preserve a genuine memory. His name and the nature of his story suggest that he had not previously possessed a formal public cult. Instead, he seems to have existed as a figure familiar mainly to local farmers. For the peasants who worked the Marathon plain, the appearance of a rustic defender fighting with a plough would have felt entirely natural. In their own fields, the tools of agriculture could easily become weapons in a moment of danger. After the battle, the hero who had defended their land was elevated to wider recognition throughout Attica. Other Greek traditions show how such figures could emerge from ritual acts or sacred sounds. Before the naval battle of Salamis, witnesses described a mysterious cloud of dust moving across the countryside, accompanied by sacred cries. The divine presence associated with those cries eventually became identified with a distinct sacred figure. In a similar way, the cult of Pan in Attica is said to have begun after his supposed intervention at Marathon. Religious imagination could transform fleeting experiences into lasting divine personalities. Agricultural songs and seasonal chants also gave rise to divine titles and sacred names. Some epithets of Demeter appear to have originated in songs sung by farmers during the harvest or while grinding grain. Even the strange figure of Lyceus seems to have begun as the name of a harvesting song before becoming a character in myth. These examples show how religious figures could emerge directly from the rhythms of rural life. Ancient agricultural practice commonly emphasized prayers to Zeus and Demeter, who were regarded as the principal guardians of the fertility of the earth. Zeus, in this context, was not primarily the ruler of the sky, but the divine power within the soil itself, the protector of crops and fields. Demeter likewise appeared under many titles connected with the growth of grain and the life of farming communities. Her festivals structured much of the agricultural year and preserved the sacred traditions surrounding planting and harvest. Images from different regions often show oxen drawing the plough under the protection of divine figures closely related to Zeus and Demeter. Yet the identity of the divine protectors of ploughing varied widely from place to place. Many heroes who later appeared in legend as inventors of the plough or of ox-drawn agriculture were probably once connected with the seasonal rituals of ploughing itself. Bousiges in Attica was remembered as the first man to yoke oxen to the plough, though he was probably not an inventor, but rather the legendary ancestor of a family whose members carried out sacred ploughing ceremonies. Dionysus was also credited in some traditions with introducing the use of oxen in agriculture. Even in later rural customs associated with Dionysian worship, prayers for abundant harvests continued to accompany ritual ploughing. Similar agricultural associations existed for Poseidon, who in some regions received offerings that depicted oxen pulling ploughs across the fields. In Athens, the goddess Athena also played an important role in agricultural rituals. She took part in sacred ploughing ceremonies and was closely associated with the earliest traditions of cultivation. Artistic representations show her standing beside the sacred plough and the ritual ploughman. One story even credited Athena with inventing the plough in order to match Demeter's gift of agriculture. According to this tale, a favoured maiden stole the plough handle and falsely claimed the invention as her own. As punishment, she was transformed into an ant, an enemy of the farmer's crops. Such traditions suggest that even the plough handle itself could be treated as a sacred object worthy of mythic explanation. Athena's connection with agriculture was not limited to Attica. In other Greek regions, she bore titles referring to the yoking of oxen and the preparation of the fields. Even in places where Demeter dominated agricultural worship, Athena retained a secondary but meaningful role in the work of cultivation. These traditions reflect a world in which many different divine figures shared responsibility for the success of the crops. Several mortals were also credited with introducing the use of the plough. In Attica, one tradition named a man called Epimenides as the inventor of ploughing. The hero Bousiges himself seems to have originated from the sacred ploughing ceremonies conducted near the Acropolis, where members of a hereditary family served as ritual ploughmen. Similar roles existed at Eleusis, where sacred ploughing formed part of the religious life of the sanctuary. Unlike Bousiges, however, Echetus shows no sign of connection with priestly families or organised public ceremonies before Marathon. This difference makes it unlikely that he belonged to the same type of tradition. Other Greek regions preserved similar stories. In Argos, a figure named Homogyrus was said to have first yoked oxen to the plough. The hero Triptolemus, famous as a bringer of agriculture to mankind, was also sometimes linked with the plough, although early images of him suggest that ploughing was not his primary role. These examples reveal how widely the symbolism of the plough was shared across Greek culture, even though the details varied from place to place. The diversity of these traditions leaves ample space for the hero of Marathon. Echetus fits naturally into a landscape filled with agricultural rituals and local protective figures. The hero who appeared on the battlefield defending his homeland with a farmer's tool drew his name from the plough handle itself. That object became especially significant at the moment when the farmer first grasped it to cut the autumn furrow and spoke a prayer for success. Echetus belongs to that moment and to that gesture. His role was so specialised that no formal cult was needed until the day when, in the imagination of the farmers of Marathon, he rose from their own fields to defend them. Only then did the rustic spirit of the plough gain recognition as a true hero honoured across Attica. The story of Perseus offers a different example of how a Greek hero could develop from local traditions into a figure known throughout the Greek world. The myth became one of the most famous heroic tales of antiquity, and its images appeared widely in Greek art. Over time, the story took on elements that connected it with traditions from the Eastern Mediterranean. Because the myth spread so widely and existed in many different forms, it is often difficult to identify the earliest local version of the hero's story. The strongest early connection of Perseus lies with Mycenae. Evidence for his worship there survives in inscriptions dating to the late Archaic period. The ancient city was destroyed in the 5th century before Christ, and its population scattered. As a result, many of its traditions disappeared before later writers began recording local myths and cult practices. For a short time in the Hellenistic age, the site was resettled, and in the Roman period, travellers still saw a spring and a shrine dedicated to Perseus along the road between Mycenae and Argos. The hero continued to be honoured by people living in the surrounding countryside. In later times, Perseus was also associated with other regions such as Seriphos and Athens, though physical traces of these cults have not survived. The city of Argos claimed many of Perseus's achievements, but does not appear to have maintained an important sanctuary for him. Stories continue to preserve his connection with Mycenae, including the tradition that he exchanged the rule of Argos for control of Mycenae and Tiryns. Even the name of Mycenae was explained through legends connected with Perseus. One tale said that part of his sword fell to the ground there, giving the place its name. Another claimed that he pulled a mushroom from the earth while searching for water and that a spring immediately burst forth. This second story suggests that the hero may have been connected with a sacred water source from an early period. Archaeological discoveries near the ruins of Mycenae support the idea of a cult centered on a spring. 2 ancient inscriptions were found in the area between the Lion Gate and a large Tholos tomb. The stones appear to have belonged to a monument associated with a water installation that existed before the later fountain house. Channels cut into the stone blocks suggest that water once flowed through metal pipes set into the structure. The inscriptions indicate that Perseus played a role in an important social institution of the community. Officials connected with his cult were expected to act as judges in disputes, when ordinary magistrates were not available. The references to parents and children suggest that these judgments concerned young men entering the adult community. Perseus, therefore, seems to have been regarded as a patron of the transition from youth to full membership in society. His cult may have played a role in marking the moment when boys became recognized as adult citizens. Many elements of the Perseus myth fit this interpretation. The hero begins life as a child cast adrift at sea with his mother, miraculously surviving against all odds. As a young man, he is sent on a dangerous mission to obtain the head of the Gorgon Medusa. With the help of divine guides, he overcomes terrifying beings and acquires magical tools that allow him to complete his task. The creatures he encounters dwell at the edge of the world, near mysterious waters associated with death and the unknown. After slaying Medusa, Perseus rescues Andromeda from a sea monster and wins her as his bride. He returns home triumphant, defeats his enemies, and eventually fulfills a tragic prophecy by causing the death of his grandfather. Perseus fits a particular kind of heroic story that speaks directly to the anxieties of growing up. His most famous victory is over a terrifying female monster, but the drama does not stop there. He also neutralizes an adult male who threatens his household, turning him into stone and ending his power in a way that reads like symbolic disarmament. Then, without intending it, he causes the death of his grandfather, the older authority figure who set the whole chain of danger in motion. In Greek storytelling, direct violence against one's father is a line that is rarely crossed, but Perseus still ends up destroying the older male forces that stand in his way, as if the conflict is shifted onto safer targets. That combination of triumph danger, and displacement makes him a believable patron for contests that mark the moment when boys prove they can leave childhood behind and step toward adult status. The act that defines him most, the beheading of the Gorgon, can be read as a harsh test that compresses fear, courage, and transformation into a single unforgettable image. Another idea helps explain why the Gorgon story struck so deeply. The Gorgon may have begun not as a distant creature of legend, but as something performed. One influential way of seeing the earliest Gorgon is as a frightening face mask, used in dance and ritual, a human-made terror meant to be confronted. Early Greece knew many kinds of masks, and later, research has expanded what is known about how they were used, even if direct early examples shaped exactly like the familiar Gorgon face are rare. Still, the broader picture is clear enough. Intimidating masks existed, and they were deployed in settings where fear was made visible, staged, and overcome. This is also consistent with the way Greek poetry sometimes treats the Gorgon as an isolated head that can be sent forth like a weapon of terror, a single object that carries dread by itself. Art later shows both the severed head and the full-bodied monster, and similar patterns appear in neighbouring cultures that imagined comparable beings. The visual language that eventually became standard across Greece seems to have absorbed older local forms and reshaped them into a widely shared image, stimulated by artistic currents coming from the Eastern Mediterranean. Yet the final, familiar Gorgon face was not simply copied from elsewhere. It was crafted within Greece, assembled from influences but developed into something distinct. The story itself also looks older than many of its surviving images. Some major elements were clearly in circulation before the Gorgon ever becomes common in art. The famous moment when Medusa is beheaded and extraordinary beings burst into the world at that instant suggests a narrative already polished and widely recognized. When a poet can mention those details in passing, it usually means an audience already knows what is being referred to. The Gorgons and the hero who defeats them, then, were likely part of Greek imagination early on, before the 7th century and before artists began to fix the scene into repeatable visual formulas. That matters because it suggests that myth and ritual performance could have been shaping each other for a long time, with the story providing a script for fear and the community providing a stage. The difficulty is that very little material survives from some key places and periods. Mycenae, for example, preserves only scattered traces from the era when local rites would have mattered most. To understand what a hero like Perseus might have meant there, it helps to look at other regions where evidence for youth training and staged transitions survived longer. In several Greek communities, the path from boy to adult was not a single leap, but a sequence of steps, each marked by contests, endurance trials, and public recognition. These rites are often described as if every male participated, but social reality was usually more selective. Where the prizes were status, access, and prestige, participation tended to be controlled. Entering the system could itself be a privilege reserved for the well-born or for those already positioned inside an elite network. Some places are especially famous for preserving older institutions. Sparta and Crete are the best-known examples, though much of the direct written testimony comes from later periods. The Argive plain also appears to have maintained distinctive social structures for a long time, including communal dining groups and systems of dependent labour that supported an aristocratic style of life. In such environments, staged contests for youth were not only personal tests, but also mechanisms that maintained hierarchy. A boy's success did not merely prove strength or courage. It signalled readiness to be counted among those who belonged. Sparta offers one of the clearest windows into how fear, masks, and youth contests could intersect. At a sanctuary by running water, a contest for young people was held, and over time, an astonishing number of terracotta masks were dedicated there. Many of these masks show grotesque, deeply lined faces that look like ancient hags, creatures designed to repel and intimidate. Other masks resemble satyrs or gorgon-like figures, and some may represent variations on the same frightening type, rather than separate categories. Most striking is the contrast provided by a different mask type. A handsome young male face, calm and idealized, a visual opposite to the wrinkled horrors. The artistic roots of several of these forms can be traced to the Eastern Mediterranean, but the performances and their meaning belong to Sparta itself. External influence could shape an image. Local institutions determined what that image was used for. Taken together, the masks and the scattered textual hints suggest dramatic confrontations. Masked figures embodying terrifying female beings, opposed by unmasked or differently masked youths, representing the beautiful and the brave. The frightening characters were not always cleanly gendered. Some masks show signs that can be read as facial hair, and that ambiguity may have been part of the effect. Figures of dread often blur boundaries, mixing masculine and feminine traits to amplify unease. Greek stories also describe monstrous women who can be bearded. In this kind of ritual theatre, uncertainty becomes a tool. A boy is not simply fighting an enemy. He is facing the confusing, unstable shape of fear itself. At this same Spartan sanctuary, victorious boys dedicated iron implements, described as sickles or short curved blades. That detail is easy to overlook, yet it matters because Perseus is famously associated with a curved, cutting weapon used to sever the Gorgon's head. Early Greek art usually shows him using a sword, and the curved blade becomes more common later, along with other specialized items that turn Perseus into a recognizable figure at a glance. The deeper background is older and broader. Stories across the Eastern Mediterranean often assign sickle-like weapons to decisive, violent separations, including battles between generations of gods and the mutilation of monstrous bodies. Greek myth uses the same tool in foundational scenes, of succession and power. In that light, the curved blade is more than a practical knife. It becomes the symbol of a terrifying but necessary cut, the act that ends one stage and begins another. For a boy on the edge of adulthood, a short, curved dagger is also the kind of weapon that fits his size and role. It is not a full warrior's sword, yet it is sharp enough to make the point. Perseus is also defined by a more ordinary piece of equipment, a pouch used to carry the severed head. Ancient language links this word to regional speech and suggests it may have belonged to an old layer of Greek vocabulary, perhaps surviving longest in places that preserve its older dialect forms. Later explanations treated the pouch as practical gear for someone moving quickly, carrying provisions while travelling hard and fast. That raises an intriguing possibility. In communities where boys were sent into the wild or made to endure time away from home as part of their training, a simple ration pouch would have been essential. Myth then does what it often does best. It takes everyday equipment and turns it into a heroic emblem so that a boy's ordinary kit becomes the hero's famous tool. Not far from Sparta, another major stronghold provides further clues. At Tiryns, deposits connected with a goddess's worship included hideous masks that have often been described as Gorgon-like, though they do not match the later standard artistic form. Small details suggest that the makers wanted these masks to be seen as female, yet without those signals the faces could look almost genderless. The masks were designed to be worn with openings that would allow a performer to see out. In the same deposit were clay models of shields, including one that seems to echo, imperfectly, an Eastern scene. The hero most closely associated with Tyrians was Heracles, a son of Zeus whose relationship with Hera is both intimate and hostile, depending on which story is told. Cult and myth do not always agree neatly. A city could honour a hero in a sanctuary tied to a goddess, even if the larger mythic tradition describes conflict between them. That mismatch can actually be a sign of local religious logic operating independently of pan-Greek storytelling. Put these elements together and a pattern emerges. In multiple places, boys may have faced staged terrors embodied by masked figures, sometimes presented as frightening females, sometimes as ambiguous monsters that resist easy classification. The youths who confronted them were not merely acting out a story for entertainment. They were rehearsing courage under pressure, learning to hold their composure in the presence of fear, humiliation, and threat. It is easy to imagine that Mycenae, a community similar in character to Tyrians and deeply connected with the Perseus tradition, once knew comparable performances, even if the physical evidence has largely vanished. If Perseus had a special role at Mycenae, the most likely moment for that role may have been earlier than the final step into full adulthood. Youth transitions often happened in stages. One step might move a child into adolescence, loosening the bond with the household and the maternal world. Another step might later move the adolescent into the adult male group, with military training and civic obligation taking the lead. The Perseus story, with its pursuit by terrifying female monsters and its flight from them, feels especially suited to the earlier transition, where fear, separation, and the first confrontations with the unknown dominate more than formal military discipline. In that phase, the boy is tested not by the battlefield but by dread, temptation, and the pressure of older authority figures. The hero's story dramatized escape from the net of childhood and entry into a wider, harsher world. Racing and pursuit likely played a major role in these rites. Across Greece, competitive running appears again and again as a youth test. Some communities staged theft games that required boys to sprint through danger, dodging blows and humiliation to seize a prize from a sacred place. In art, one of the most popular Perseus scenes shows him running, pursued by the monsters he has awakened, relying on speed to survive. The names of the chasing Gorgons themselves evoke strength and wide-leaping motion. It is not the most noble image of heroism, but it is vivid and deeply human. A boy who has ever been chased, tested, or forced to run the gauntlet can understand it immediately. At Mycenae, the surest anchor for Perseus remains a spring. Springs and rivers often appear in initiation contexts, not only as symbolic boundaries, but as practical sites for purification. Water marks change. It cleans, it witnesses oaths, it frames dances and public performances. Spirits of springs are frequently portrayed as gentle toward the young, and in several Greek cities, youthful groups swore their commitments in sanctuaries, tied to protective female figures whose names evoke moisture, dew, and freshness. In Sparta, the dominant power in the youth sanctuary became a goddess closely associated with nurture and protection. In Corinth, a spring sanctuary has been linked to a female presence of similar type. It would be natural to expect that the Perseus rites at Mycenae, centered on a spring, also involved a powerful female divinity in the background, even if pan-Greek mythology does not emphasize that link. A boundary marker associated with Hera was found in the area tied to Perseus worship, and nearby communities show how easily a hero's local cult could be braided together with the authority of a major goddess. If another son of Zeus was connected with Hera in Mycenae's religious landscape, that connection may have remained local, never becoming part of the more standardized myth known across Greece. Perseus is usually remembered as a monster slayer, but behind the famous story there is another side. the way a hero can become anchored to a specific landscape. At Mycenae, the most solid thread is not a dragon, not a gorgon, not a palace legend, but water, especially a spring. Springs are more than sources of drinking water in ancient Greek life. They carry a feeling of boundary and transition. They are places where a community gathers, where oaths can be taken, where the young can be presented, purified, tested, and publicly recognized. If Perseus had a strong local presence in the Argolid, a spring is exactly the kind of place where his name could have been kept alive, even when other memories faded. A spring-centered hero rarely stands alone. The landscape around sacred water tends to collect smaller presences. Helpful spirits, local female figures, and minor divine companions who feel natural in that setting. In the familiar Perseus story, the hero does not simply seize what he needs from the frightening old sisters who guard crucial knowledge. Instead, he forces information out of hostile figures, then reaches kinder powers who provide the tools willingly. The sequence matters. The journey moves from danger to assistance, from harsh gatekeepers to benevolent helpers. In narrative terms, it creates a rhythm. First mastery over fear, then support for the final confrontation. In religious terms, it resembles the way rites often work. An intimidating threshold, then a guiding hand. The helpers in the Perseus tale are often imagined as nymph-like beings who live near waters at the edges of the world. Even if that distant setting is mythic, the emotional logic is familiar. Water spirits in Greek tradition are frequently good to the young. They are not the monsters a boy must defeat. They are the powers that allow him to survive the trial. That is why, if a spring sanctuary at Mycenae truly mattered for young males and their public transition into new status, it would make sense to expect a second layer of figures beside Perseus, smaller, more local, more intimate with the spring itself. The hero can be the headline, but the water world often has its own supporting cast. The Perseus story also keeps returning to the sea. The rescue of Andromeda is one of the clearest examples. A young woman bound beside the water, threatened by a marine monster, saved by the arriving hero. On the surface, it is an adventure episode, but it also looks like a stylized scene of crossing into a new stage of life. The sea is danger and possibility at the same time, an unstable boundary that can swallow you or transform you. In many cultures, coming-of-age ceremonies echo sea imagery, even in inland regions, because the sea symbolizes the unknown, and the passage from safety to risk. When myths repeat sea motifs around youth and testing, it is rarely accidental. It is the vocabulary of transition. If Mycenae had its own older version of the Perseus story, the best clues may have been absorbed and reshaped over time. A local female presence tied to the spring could have existed under a name that later myth reinterpreted. Greek myth loves to recycle names of water beings, daughters of ocean, spirits of rivers, wives of solar gods, turning local, place-bound figures into characters of a wider cosmology. A spring spirit can become a genealogy figure. A local lady of the waters can become a distant, literary nymph. The story still carries her fingerprints, but the name travels. That raises a larger question. How far back can Perseus at Mycenae really go? The name has a form that feels old, the kind of shape often seen in heroic and cult names, that look as if they belong to earlier layers of Greek speech. But names alone do not prove continuity. The hero might be ancient, or he might be a later figure, fitted into an older place. The fact that Perseus and the Gorgon do not appear in early art until later centuries does not settle the matter either. Early artistic traditions were selective. They did not illustrate everything people believed or performed. A story can live for generations in speech, song, and ritual long before artists choose to picture it. What is clearer is that Perseus in the Mycenaean region makes strong sense in the world of the archaic city-state. That era is full of structured transitions. Youths grouped by age, public contests, symbolic performances, communal witnessing, and the awarding of status. A hero who defeats terrors, outruns pursuers, and returns changed fits perfectly as a patron figure for young people approaching adulthood. If local institutions at Mycenae used contests and dances to mark entry into civic life, Perseus would be an ideal banner, especially if the sanctuary sat near a spring where purification and gathering were already natural. But the late Bronze Age palace world is a different universe. Palatial administration, elite control of production, and royal ideology do not look like the later citizen-based institutions of archaic Greece. That does not mean rites of transition did not exist earlier. Many societies have them. But it does mean the social function could have been different. If there was continuity, it may not have been continuity of the same institution, but continuity of place and feeling. A spring remains a spring even when the political system collapses. People can move, elites can fall, palaces can burn, but water still draws human life back to the same point. Through local populations who survived periods of upheaval, the name of a spring and the aura around it could pass to newcomers. Later, settlers could adapt what they inherited, attaching new civic meanings to an older sacred landscape. This is where the bigger Mediterranean background becomes important. Greek myths do not develop in isolation. Stories of heroes defeating monsters, confronting threatening older powers, and using special tools to cut down a horror are widespread across the eastern Mediterranean. Greece absorbed motifs, reshaped them, and fused them with local practice. A community could already have a youth contest at a spring, complete with dance, masks, and symbolic threats. When a powerful story pattern arrives, through contact, trade, migration, or shared artistic language, it can snap into place like a new skin over an older ritual structure. The institution remains local. The story becomes international. Over time, the local hero may begin to look like the famous hero, and the famous hero may borrow details from the local performance. Influence can run both ways. Centuries later, political power changes the meaning of heroic legacies. Argos eventually stood as the dominant city in the region. And when a city like that looks at nearby ruins, places like Tiryns and Mycenae, it also sees usable prestige. Heroes are symbolic capital. A dominant city can claim ancient figures, honour them publicly, and distribute their honours as political rewards. Perseus becomes more than a local spring hero or a patron of youthful transition. He becomes a badge that officials can hand out to signal status and favour. Coins, monuments, and civic stories turn the hero into a public emblem. In that later landscape, Argos also seems to gather a striking cluster of themes in one area. Water that once flowed openly and later ran underground, a tribunal space tied to judgment, and the presence of the Gorgon's head as a powerful object. Even without forcing a direct connection, the pattern is suggestive. Springs, judgment, and the Gorgon image all carry the atmosphere of threshold moments, testing, decision, transformation, and the controlled use of fear. It is tempting to imagine that older local structures lay behind these later civic forms, even if the details cannot be recovered with certainty. There is one more twist. In the Hellenistic period, small communities sometimes preserved institutions that seemed surprisingly sophisticated, for their size, including organised youth groups. A village retaining its own training system, its own ephebic structure, or its own ceremonial identity, can look like a fossil from an older age. That does not prove direct survival, but it does show how stubborn local tradition can be. A larger city might even encourage such revivals because ancientness has value. Restoring a shrine, rebuilding a monument, or sponsoring old ceremonies can create an aura that benefits the present. In the early 18th century, a French traveller moving through Athens was shown an inscription built into a church wall in a neighbourhood of the old city. He copied the text by hand. Later, generations of scholars republished it, compared readings, and tried to reconstruct the missing details. The church was rebuilt, the stone vanished, and the inscription itself became one of those historical ghosts that survive only through earlier copies. Even so, the text matters because it opens a narrow window into how Athens organised money, military life, and sacred space during the tense decades before the Peloponnesian War. The decree describes a compulsory payment imposed on Athens' land forces. It sets different rates for different kinds of troops. Horsemen pay the most each year. Heavy infantry pay a smaller amount. Archers pay less again, and the archers include both citizens and foreigners. This is not a voluntary donation. It is framed as an obligation tied directly to military service. The decree even explains what happens if someone refuses to pay. The amount can be withheld from whatever pay that soldier receives. That detail immediately places the text in a world where military pay is already part of routine administration, and where the state feels confident enough to enforce deductions. The money is not described as a general war fund. It is directed to Apollo. Specifically, the decree appoints 2 treasurers connected with Apollo's funds, selected from within the council. Their job is to receive the money from local officials and then oversee the upkeep of Apollo's sacred precinct. The council's schedule gives priority to Apollo's finances, a small but revealing sign of how religious maintenance could be folded into the machinery of government. The decree also compares these treasurers to treasurers connected with a mother goddess, which suggests Athens already had a pattern of assigning separate officials to different sacred funds before later reforms created broader boards of treasurers. The likely date sits in the middle of the 5th century, after letter forms and administrative habits had evolved past the earliest democratic period, but before later financial reorganization consolidated religious revenues under larger umbrella offices. More importantly, the text assumes regular pay for the land forces. The precise moment when Athens began paying its infantry consistently is not pinned down by a single surviving document, but by the time Athens was mobilizing large numbers for campaigns. Pay was becoming a tool of discipline and logistics. A decree like this makes best sense in an era of serious mobilization, when the state needs predictable revenue and the army is large enough to cause real wear on a training ground. One striking feature is how the contributors are defined. The decree does not sort men by property classes or census categories. It sorts them by battlefield function. Cavalry, hoplites, archers. A poor man serving as heavy infantry is still charged. A wealthy man not serving is not charged. Service is the line, not wealth on paper. That reveals something important about how Athens understood obligation. The duty is attached to participation, not merely to status. The decree also reveals something about organization. Archers are treated differently from cavalry and hoplites when it comes to collection. For men listed in local registers, the collectors are demarchs, local officials connected to each dem. Archers, however, have taxes collected by toxarchs, their own commanders. That split hints at a practical problem the Athenians wanted to solve. Demes can collect from people rooted in local communities. Commanders can collect from men who may not be locally registered. including foreigners who serve in specialist roles. Foreign archers were a known presence in Athens. Some were attached to policing and public order. Others could be hired for campaigns. Archers, unlike hoplites, were easier to recruit as specialists from outside the citizen body, and their administrative oversight naturally ran through military chains of command. If a group of archers is temporary, mobile, or foreign-born, demanding payment through a deme official would be clumsy. Collecting through commanders is direct, enforceable, and tied to the same system that organises their service. The cavalry, too, tells its own story. Athenian cavalry became a more regular, organised force around the middle of the 5th century. Whether every cavalryman received the same kind of pay as infantry is debated in later sources, but the decree assumes the state can withhold sums from soldiers' pay if needed. That suggests some form of payment exists across categories, or at least across those categories named in the decree. Even if some troops thought of certain payments as allowances rather than wages, the machinery of deductions still functions only if money is already moving through official hands. Then there is the scale. At first glance, the tax might look small, yet when the numbers of troops are large, even a modest annual contribution becomes meaningful. It is not the kind of money that builds a grand temple from scratch. It is the kind of money that maintains a precinct. Fencing, levelling, repairing ground, preserving boundaries, keeping altars and sacred areas in usable condition. Maintenance is the quiet labour that prevents a sanctuary from becoming a trampled wasteland, especially if it is used heavily. That brings the story to the most important question. Which Apollo is this, and why are the land forces paying him? The answer becomes clearer once the purpose of the fund is taken seriously. The decree is not concerned with the navy, even though Athens' power rested above all on ships. The contributors are specifically the land forces. The money is earmarked for a sacred precinct, and the precinct is described in a way that makes it sound like open ground rather than a temple complex. Put those details together and the picture sharpens. This looks like the precinct used for musters and exercises by hoplites and cavalry, an open training area just outside the city. That points to Apollo Lyceus and the place later famous as the Lyceum. Before it became associated with philosophers and formal education, it was first a sacred precinct. It also served as a space where land forces gathered, practiced, and assembled. It did not need a grand temple to function as a cult site. An altar and a defined sacred boundary could be enough. For military use, the key feature was space. A large open area near the city could host musters, inspections, and drills for cavalry and infantry. And that kind of use damages ground quickly. Horses churn soil, trample grass, create ruts, and turn open land into dust. A large body of infantry causes wear too, but cavalry is especially destructive. If the precinct's primary function included training and assembly, upkeep becomes a constant concern. Comedy and practical military writing both reflect the reality that Athenians knew the Lyceum as a place of musters and movement with spear and shield. It was not an abstract sacred grove. It was a working zone where citizen soldiers spent long hours assembling and waiting. A land army made up of farmers, craftsmen, and traders could not train year-round like a full-time Spartan system. But even limited musters required a reliable space close enough to the city to be used repeatedly. The Lyceum provided that. The place had more than one identity over time. It was a sanctuary. It was a military exercise ground. It later became a gymnasium for athletic training. At least once, it also functioned as a civic assembly space, a site where the people gathered and decisions were made. These roles are often explained as an accident of geography, a convenient open area near Athens that different groups used for different reasons. But there may be something deeper. A place where citizen soldiers gather for musters can also become a place where citizens gather politically, because the body of armed men and the body of voters overlap in critical periods. A sanctuary that hosts these gatherings adds religious weight to collective action. Space, religion, and citizenship can reinforce each other. The Lyceum's early history is tangled because later fame tends to overwrite earlier function. Philosophers and students leave a strong imprint on memory, yet the older layers never fully vanish. The inscriptions focus on land forces, on upkeep of a precinct, and on Apollo as recipient, fits a landscape where military and sacred duties are not separate spheres, but overlapping responsibilities. The state funds the sanctuary because the state uses the sanctuary. The soldiers pay because the soldiers are the ones who wear down the ground. The god receives the money because the place remains sacred, even when filled with horses and drills. This also explains why collectors are chosen as they are. Local officials collect from those rooted in Deme records. Commanders collect from specialist archers, who may include foreigners and short-term personnel. The money is then handed over in a controlled process to treasurers responsible for Apollo's funds, with leading council officers present as witnesses. Nothing here is casual. The text describes a system built to prevent leakage, enforce compliance, and protect the sanctuary's resources. The Lyceum was not only a training ground and a sacred precinct. It almost certainly had its own rhythm of worship through the year. Even if the grandest ceremonies happened only every few years, smaller annual offerings would still have marked the site as living religious space. A state calendar of sacrifices preserves a hint of that cycle. It lists an offering of a sheep to Hermes at the Lyceum. Nearby in the schedule are rites for the major civic gods, and shortly afterward, on a day strongly associated with Apollo, a small offering appears that looks like a modest gesture toward the god of the precinct himself. By itself, that is not a big festival. It feels more like a regular reminder, a small annual act that keeps the relationship with the place alive. A Deme calendar gives a clearer picture of how the Lyceum could be pulled into a broader, civic framework. On a summer date in the Attic year, a delegation from one dame comes into the city for sacrifice, and one of the offerings is made in the city, meaning at Athens rather than in the countryside. The meat is not allowed to be carried away, which suggests a controlled ritual meal on the spot, a gathering that binds participants to the sanctuary and to each other. What makes that day striking is the company the Lyceum keeps. The same calendar sets sacrifices on the Acropolis for Zeus Polyus and Athena Polius, and it includes an offering to Demeter in the city's Eleusinian. In other words, Apollo Lyceus is being honoured alongside the gods of the civic centre, and the goddess tied to the city's survival through food. That positioning matters. It implies that Lyceus, in the Athenian imagination, is not a marginal god of the outskirts. His sanctuary stands outside the walls, but his cult is woven into the core religious fabric of the polis. The same Dem calendar shows Apollo being honoured under multiple titles during a winter festival. Lyceus appears there as part of a broader sequence where Apollo is approached in several modes, as the god connected with the Delphic world, as a leader linked with nymphs and watery companions, and as a power who wards off danger. The pattern is revealing. A small dem does not necessarily maintain separate shrines for every form of Apollo. Instead, it can fold different aspects of the god into a single festival space, using one sanctuary to address the many faces of a divine figure. That is likely what is happening here. Lyceus is honoured as part of a cluster of Apollos, while the large public worship in Athens provides the main, city-wide focus. Outside the city itself, the evidence for Lyceus in Attica is thin. A rough stone marked only by the name suggests a boundary or a simple sign of a sacred area somewhere in the countryside. Another text from later centuries suggests land connected to a sacred precinct, being leased and cultivated, under conditions that included offerings. Neither record is rich in detail. Yet their locations raise an interesting possibility. Both sites are near the edges of Athenian territory, where garrisons and fortifications mattered. A cult tied to musters and discipline would make sense in such places. Even if those rural sanctuaries were small, they could have served as local points of assembly or prayer for men stationed far from the city. Still, the strongest conclusion remains simple. Most Athenians met Apollo Lyceus through military life, through their service in the land forces that gathered at the Lyceum in Athens. Across the Greek world, Apollo Lyceus appears in many places, from the eastern Aegean to the western colonies. Despite this wide spread, the character of the cult is surprisingly hard to pin down in later historical periods. Scholarship has often focused less on what the cult did and more on what the name might mean. Ancient explanations pulled in different directions. One line of thought connected the epithet with light. Another tried to link it to the people of Lycia in Asia Minor. A third related it to wolves, drawing on the Greek word for wolf and imagining a god whose sphere included predators, boundaries, and the protection of flocks. The wolf explanation has become the most common, but even there debate remains. Some prefer the wolf as symbol, rather than literal divine form. Others have wondered whether the god was ever imagined as wolf-like, in any direct way. A different approach changes the question. Instead of asking what the word means in a dictionary sense, it asks what kind of social institution could have shaped the god's identity. In several Greek-speaking regions, annual gatherings of adult males are known. Assemblies that can function as political meetings, military musters, and public moments when young men are integrated into the adult group. In those settings, Apollo appears as a youthful figure, not an old, kingly god, but a long-haired youth who embodies the ideal male at the turning point between training and full membership. This is a powerful image because it ties divinity to a social threshold. It suggests a god who stands at the doorway, where boys become men. But the Greek world was never uniform. Institutions differ sharply from place to place, and a plausible early pattern can survive in one region while fading in another. In Athens, the main festival of the phratries is dominated by Zeus in a strongly civic and genealogical role, and Apollo does not clearly occupy the same ceremonial position that appears in some Western Greek communities. The result is a puzzle that historians often face. A convincing model exists, but the surviving evidence does not line up neatly everywhere. A single name can travel widely, while the institution that once gave it meaning changes or disappears. The wolf symbolism adds another layer. Studies of initiation practices across Greek culture have explored the wolf as a creature of the margins, clever, secretive, and associated with wild spaces beyond the city. In this reading, the young man during his transitional period resembles the wolf, not fully inside society, living close to the border both physically and socially, learning to survive before he is accepted as a full civic warrior. That is a compelling model for certain Greek initiation systems, especially those that emphasize liminality, life on the edge, and symbolic wildness. Yet Athens seems to place Apollo Lyceus somewhere different in the life cycle. The Athenian evidence links him strongly with the assembled adult land forces. His worship is tied to civic religion, and aligned with the major gods of the polis. The Lyceum itself is the space where hoplites and cavalry practice and muster. That is not the world of the wild adolescent. It is the world of men who have already passed through earlier thresholds. Men who are recognized and organized. This becomes even clearer when looking at the oath taken by Athenian youths at the beginning of their final training period. The list of divine witnesses emphasizes a set of gods appropriate to men not yet fully admitted to the rights and responsibilities of adult membership. Apollo is not prominent there. That absence is not a small detail. It matches the broader pattern. In Athens, Lyceus appears as the god of those who have already arrived. He belongs to the endpoint, the moment when a man is counted among the assembled defenders of the community. Two possibilities follow. One is that in Attica, the wolf associations never strongly attach themselves to the adolescent phase at all. The other is that they once existed, but the historical formation of Athens pulled different traditions into different places. The transitional phase may have been filled by other myths, other gods, other local rituals, while Apollo Lyceus became fixed to the moment of completion, the moment when the transition ends and the adult body gathers. If that is true, then the Lyceum's later development makes more sense. Once the sanctuary is understood as a gathering place of adult warriors, the other features that grew up around it fall into a coherent story. A citizen army is never only military. It is always potentially political. Men who assemble with weapons can also assemble as a voting body, especially in early periods when the hoplite class carries decisive weight. In moments of crisis, the overlap between army and community becomes obvious. In Athens, that overlap changes over time as political power expands and as military forces become more diverse. But the old logic lingers. The athletic gymnasium that later became famous at the Lyceum can be seen as an outgrowth of the same space. A place for training the body, celebrating competition, and shaping elite identity. Tyrants and leading statesmen could encourage this athletic face of the sanctuary, emphasizing controlled competition rather than uncontrolled political force. Later, under a mature democracy, the Lyceum can reflect social pluralism. An elite cavalry element training beside poorer citizens and foreign specialists, all using the same precinct and all contributing to its upkeep, even as the gymnasium remains naturally attractive to the well-off. This is why the Lyceum is so revealing. It gathers multiple strands in one place: religion, military practice, civic identity, and athletic culture, without needing to treat them as separate worlds. It is not simply that a convenient open area was reused for different purposes. The deeper connection is that all these activities revolve around the same question: who belongs, who is prepared, and who stands as a recognized defender of the city. Tragedy sometimes preserves a raw edge that official cult language smooths out. When Greek choruses call on Apollo Lyceus, they are not always thinking like priests. They are thinking like people under pressure. In one play, the prayer is almost a command. Be wolfish against the enemy. The word Lyceus is allowed to bite. It becomes a weapon word, a way to turn the god into a predator on the city's side. That is not a calm image of Apollo as musician or oracle. It is Apollo as a fierce presence at the moment of crisis, the kind of divine ally a threatened community wants. In another tragic scene, Lyceus is asked to be gentle to the young. The tone flips from aggression to care, and the context matters. The chorus is describing a society that wants health, stability, and a land that produces. In Greek thought, Apollo sits right on the fault line between those desires. He can lift disease, but he can also send it. He can protect a city, but he can also punish it. So the request for a kindly Lyceus is not sentimental. It is the kind of prayer people make when they know the god is powerful in both directions. It sits among wishes for peace and fertility, but it also carries the shadow of war and plague. Even the word used for youth can sound like a social group, ready to be called up, the age band that becomes the army. In that sense, a prayer for the young is also a prayer for the city's strength. Greek drama also loves local geography. When a play is set in Argos, the poet can treat Lyceus as a nearby power, a god whose shrine feels almost within walking distance of the characters. That closeness changes the emotional temperature of prayer. Both the guilty and the innocent appeal to him because proximity makes him feel available. He becomes not just a distant Olympian, but the god standing beside the road, listening. In some stories, he appears as the interpreter of signs and dreams, the one who can confirm whether an omen is favourable or threatening, and the one who guides vengeance toward its target. The effect is subtle but strong. The audience is made to feel that divine judgment is not abstract. It is near. In other cities, Lyceus can also be imagined as a protector against disaster, especially when the threat is disease rather than soldiers. Here, Apollo's arrows are no longer directed at the enemy army. They are directed at a plague. The language is still martial: arrows, champions, defenders. But the battlefield is the city itself. The god becomes healer and purifier, the one who can reveal the cause of suffering and then remove it. This is important because it shows how flexible the epithet is in poetic use. Lyceus can be wolfish against an invading force, gentle toward the city's youth, and deadly against disease. The title doesn't trap the god into a single function. It opens a set of associations that poets choose from depending on the story they are telling. Then, quite suddenly, the discussion shifts to a different god and a different puzzle. Dionysus is the god most strongly linked with sexuality in Greek culture, especially through the phallus in festival and ritual. Yet when Greek artists depict Dionysus himself, they often do something unexpected. They keep him at a distance from the sexual chaos around him. He is surrounded by beautiful female companions and by male satyrs, who behave like pure appetite, but the god rarely joins their pursuit. He may sit, drink, dance, or watch, but he is not shown as one more predator in the scene. The satyrs broadcast male desire even when they are not explicitly aroused. Their very presence signals it. Dionysus, by contrast, is calm, self-contained, almost untouchable. The visual contrast becomes sharper when attention turns to clothing. In many early images, Dionysus wears long garments that cover him completely, even in contexts where other male gods or heroes might be shown with more exposed bodies. Greek art uses male nudity as a language of power and confidence. It is common for strongly masculine gods. Dionysus resists that language for a long time. His costume is not automatically women's clothing, and in earlier periods it can look like an aristocratic style rather than a feminine one. Still, later stage portrayals emphasize robes, with strong feminine associations, as if comedy and performance traditions are willing to say out loud what vase painting often hints more quietly. Dionysus is male, but not conventionally virile in the way Apollo or Zeus are shown. When the god's image shifts in later art from a bearded adult to a youthful, beardless figure, something else happens. His body becomes more visible, sometimes partly nude. But instead of becoming more aggressively masculine, he becomes softer, graceful, elegant, almost languid. It is as if removing the beard does not intensify his masculinity. It transforms it into a different kind of beauty. Greek artists render him as a seductive youth, but not a dominating one. The result is a god who exists at an angle to ordinary male roles. He is central to a cult of fertility and ecstatic release, yet he is not depicted as a straightforward sexual conqueror. Ritual images make the paradox even stranger. In scenes of Athenian worship, Dionysus can appear not as a fully formed statue, but as something simpler. A pillar or trunk dressed in a tunic, with a mask attached as the god's face. This is a powerful image because it feels older than classical sculpture. The god is present as a sign and a costume, not as a realistic body. Similar pillar forms appear for other gods too. But in Dionysus' case, the imagery sits beside a cult environment where the phallus can be large, public, even exaggerated in procession. That raises a tempting question. Were these pillar images meant to be phallic in shape? Was the god once imagined as a living phallus, later given a face and clothes to make him more acceptable? The evidence does not force that conclusion. In some Greek places outside Athens, there are hints of Dionysus represented as a trunk or pole carried in procession, sometimes explicitly linked to phallic themes. There are also titles and local stories that emphasize male generative power. Yet even where phallic symbolism is strongest, Greek culture often distinguishes between the god and the phallus. The phallus can be treated as a companion figure, a spirit of procession, a comic creature brought to life with eyes and legs rather than the god himself. In other words, the cult can celebrate sexual power openly, while still refusing to collapse Dionysus into a single anatomical symbol. That refusal is the key. Dionysus is the god of the phallus, but he is not simply the phallus personified. Greek artists and ritual imagination keep a gap between the emblem and the deity. The god can be linked with fertility, intoxication, and release without being rendered as a crude embodiment of male sexuality. He can be surrounded by lust without being shown as lustful. He can be male while carrying qualities that Greeks sometimes label feminine, or even qualities that blur both categories. Dionysus looks, at first glance, like he should belong beside Aphrodite. One presides over wine, the other over desire, and both hover around the pleasures of the symposium. Yet when mythic storytelling is examined closely, the two are rarely joined in any major way. They cross paths only at the edges of genealogy, in a few localized traditions, and in occasional lyric fantasies that use them as symbols of erotic power. Even then, the pairing never becomes a dominant narrative. It is as if Greek imagination preferred to keep Dionysus slightly apart from the most obvious love-goddess framework. In drama, the contrast becomes sharper. Some stories push Aphrodite and Dionysus into competition rather than partnership, especially when male authority tries to explain female religious escape as mere sexual license. At the same time, Dionysus can be described with a kind of seductive charm that sounds almost aphrodisiac. The point is not that one tradition wins, but that the culture is comfortable holding both ideas at once. Dionysus can be invoked as a force close to desire, yet he is rarely allowed to become simply another form of Aphrodite. Instead, Dionysus receives a different kind of love story, one that is unusually calm. His most enduring attachment is Ariadne. In many versions, she is not conquered or hunted. She is found after abandonment, rescued from humiliation, and folded into a new life. Artists and storytellers often present the pair as an image of contented partnership. The erotic element is present, but it is softened, domesticated, and framed as a stable bond rather than a violent surge of appetite. That matters because it sits in striking contrast to the stormy world that typically surrounds Dionysus. The whirling women in ecstatic dance, and the satyrs who represent unchecked male impulse. This gentler theme has a strong echo in civic ritual. In Athens, there was a recurring ceremony that treated Dionysus as a groom and placed the city's most ancient official household at the centre of the act. The wife of the magistrate, known as the king, played the key role, assisted by a select group of honoured women. Part of the rite was public and visible, shaped like a wedding procession. Part of it was hidden, guarded by strict rules, and remembered in sources mainly because a later scandal made the rules discussable. Exactly what happened behind closed doors cannot be pinned down with certainty. Some reconstructions imagine a living impersonation of Dionysus. Others, a symbolic union conducted before an image. And some prefer to see the entire marriage as a ritual, meaning produced by the procession itself, rather than by any explicit physical act. What can be said with confidence is this: the ceremony does not look like a celebration of wild sexuality. It looks like the opposite. Sexuality controlled, fenced in, made civic, made legitimate. Even the direction of movement matters. Instead of bringing the bride into a god's house, the ritual draws what is divine toward the space of an official human household. The god is aligned with the city's order. Dionysus is not erased, but he is edited into a form that can bless marriage without becoming a threat to it. If Dionysus is so central to the erotic energies of Greek imagination, where are his affairs, the classic stories where a god pursues a mortal out of lust? They exist only faintly. A few hints appear here and there, but they never become the standard pattern. Some traditions even portray him as the one acted upon, the one promised as a passive reward, which is an unusual role for a male god. In other words, myth keeps Dionysus oddly detached from the typical divine script of conquest. The culture seems to prefer him as a force that stirs desire in others, not as a figure defined by personal appetite. Now, the real puzzle comes into focus. The myth and the imagery often portray Dionysus as distant from erotic action. Yet his public worship can be the most explicit display of sexual symbolism in the ancient world. Festivals in town and countryside paraded phallic images with open pride. Cities and colonies were expected to contribute these objects. Processions carried them through streets and displayed them before crowds and before the god's image. In some places, elaborate versions were built and renewed regularly, treated as civic statements as much as religious ones. Whatever philosophical meanings later thinkers wanted to add, the basic sign remains direct. A phallus is not an ambiguous symbol. It announces sex, potency, and the raw force of life. And yet even here, the division of roles matters. Public phallic processions appear to have been dominated by men, even when women and children were present in the festival. Greek writers notice with curiosity when other cultures place the phallic object in women's hands, as if that reversal is part of what makes the foreign rite feel startling. Meanwhile, in women's secret cults elsewhere in Greek religion, representations of sexual organs could appear in a different register, tied to fertility, agriculture, and the continuity of the community. The point is not that women were ignorant of sexual symbolism. The point is that Dionysus' loud, public phallic display seems to belong especially to male, civic performance. That does not mean women were absent from Dionysus. Quite the opposite. More than any other major male god, Dionysus is deeply entangled with women's religious life. There were women's groups attached to his worship, women with titles and duties, women who received portions of sacrificial meat, women who acted as key agents in ceremonies, where men could not enter. Some rites were surely private, inaccessible to outsiders, and that privacy is part of why later imagination filled the gaps with fantasies of sexual excess. A woman leaving the house at night, drinking wine, stepping outside ordinary surveillance, This is inherently charged in a society built around control. Even if real behavior was disciplined, the scenario itself invites suspicion, and drama exploits that suspicion again and again. So a pattern emerges. Public Dionysiac celebration can emphasize male sexuality in its most exaggerated emblem. Women's Dionysiac experience can emphasize release, separation, altered states, and a momentary escape from the usual limits. When Greek art brings satyrs and maenads together, it stages the collision of those two energies, male and female, inside a single imaginative frame. And in the centre stands Dionysus, the figure who is somehow both and neither, male, yet not aggressively masculine, connected to fertility, yet not reducible to it, surrounded by erotic chaos, yet personally calm. This is where the contradictions stop looking like mistakes. Dionysus functions as a boundary figure. His power lies in making categories unstable: male and female, citizen and outsider, restraint and excess, order and frenzy. A society can tolerate that instability only if it also imagines a centre that can hold it without exploding. Dionysus is portrayed as that centre. He can preside over forces that would normally threaten the household and the city, and he can do it with a quietness that feels unsettling. His marriage stories are gentle. His civic marriage ritual is controlled. His festival symbols are outrageous. His women's rites are hidden. The whole complex is not a neat system, and it never was. It shifts over time, changes with politics and taste, and looks different from one community to another. But the underlying tension remains recognizable. A god who releases pressure, a cult that plays with danger, and a divine image that refuses to be pinned down. Michael Jameson belonged to a type of classicist that has become increasingly rare, the scholar who refuses to live inside a single speciality. He moved comfortably between inscriptions, history, and archaeology. But he never treated those fields like separate worlds. Poetry mattered to him just as much as stone texts. Painted pottery mattered as much as battlefield narratives. Sculpture mattered as much as documentary prose. The point was simple and relentless. The ancient Greek world left only fragments behind, and the only honest way to approach it is to examine every fragment with equal seriousness. That principle comes to life most clearly when Jameson wrote about ritual. Instead of starting with a theory and hunting for supporting examples, he worked the other way around. He gathered every kind of testimony available and let the pattern emerge. Words, images, objects, and repeated actions all counted as evidence. Even what looked minor or strange could become decisive once it was placed beside everything else. One of his most influential studies explored what Greek armies did before they fought. It turns out there was not just one pre-battle sacrifice, but a range of actions carried out in different settings and for different purposes. Sometimes the ritual looked like a standard communal offering followed by cooking and eating. At other times it was stark and immediate, performed near the line of conflict, oriented toward the enemy and the territory ahead. In that second form, the animal was killed, but the act did not turn into a shared meal. The meaning was not hospitality, it was focus, warning, and intent. What made Jameson's treatment powerful was his refusal to flatten these practices into a single explanation. He showed that both kinds of rites could overlap in one crucial function. They were used to read the future. The animal was not only an offering, it was also a medium through which the army sought signs about the outcome to come. The sacrifice was simultaneously religious action and practical decision-making under pressure. The most debated of these rites, the grim offering performed at the edge of battle, had long attracted comparisons to purification ceremonies and to distant scapegoat customs. Jameson challenged those parallels. He did not deny that purifications existed, or that other cultures pushed animals out toward enemies. But he argued that the battlefield rite is better understood on its own terms as a deliberately forceful action that trains the mind and the body for what is about to happen. The killing is not symbolic in a vague way. It is direct. A soldier uses a weapon of war, not a delicate ritual tool. The victim is treated as a stand-in for the opponent. The act compresses fear, aggression, and resolve into a single visible moment. The throat is cut now so that the enemy's throat can be cut next. That interpretation becomes even more persuasive when visual evidence is brought into the picture. In the rare cases where artists chose to depict this rite, they emphasize details that match the battlefield logic. The victim is male. The killer is armed like a fighter, and the weapon is not separated from combat. The image reinforces the idea that this is not simply religion before battle, but a ritual that prepares the army to do violence, and to imagine that violence as effective and final. Jameson's approach also shines in a very different kind of investigation. A single painted scene on a vase. Many scholars see images as decoration or as loosely religious. He treated them like documents. One particular vase shows a sacrifice at an altar, a crowded scene with observers and officiants. It is unusual, and that unusualness was precisely the point. Jameson's method was to take the odd image seriously rather than dismiss it as a fantasy. The breakthrough came not from another book, but from knowledge of bodies. Jameson learned animal anatomy in practical detail, the kind of knowledge most classicists never seek. He understood how organs sit, how they look when handled, and what happens when certain fluids meet fire. That practical competence allowed him to see something on the vase that others missed. The officiant is not performing a generic gesture. He is squeezing a gallbladder over flame, producing vivid flashes and reactions that would have been read as signs. Suddenly the image made sense as an illustration of a dramatic description of a sacrifice gone wrong, where the expected omens fail and the rite becomes ominous. The painted scene was not a random ritual, it was a visual echo of a specific narrative moment in tragedy, and it only becomes visible once the viewer knows how sacrifice actually works at the level of hands, organs, and fire. That same insistence on ritual realism shaped his reading of famous stone sculpture as well. A set of reliefs shows victory figures killing bulls, an image that earlier interpretations often treated as decorative, symbolic, or purely celebratory. Jameson pressed a harder question. What exact ritual does this resemble? And once the comparison is made to the battlefield sacrifice, the scene snaps into focus. The bull is not simply a trophy of abundance. It is a stand-in for the enemy. The killing belongs to the beginning of conflict, a ritual act that imagines the opponent already doomed. Then, Jameson linked that scene to another set of victory images on the same monument. Figures erecting trophies. Now, the two actions form a sequence. One ritual anticipates the enemy's destruction. The other ritual fixes that destruction in place. The trophy is not only a record of what happened, it is a device meant to make the enemy's defeat stick, to bind the outcome into the landscape and warn against return. The armor hung on a post becomes a human-shaped effigy emptied of agency. The act of fastening and fixing carries a message. This rout is irreversible, and the defeated are not coming back. In his study of ritual meals offered to gods and heroes, Jameson turned to a different body of evidence, especially inscriptions and images of sacred tables. Here again, the method remained the same. He collected every mention of food laid out for divine guests, every rule about what could and could not be removed from a sanctuary, every small relief showing a figure seated as if to dine. The result was not a dramatic single answer, but something more valuable. A map of how varied and sometimes contradictory the evidence is. Some sanctuaries treat the divine meal like a shared banquet with strict boundaries. Others emphasize the offering as display, with rules that prevent worshippers from treating sacred food as ordinary leftovers. The practice is consistent enough to recognize, yet diverse enough to resist a simplistic formula. That honesty is part of why Jameson's work has lasted. Instead of forcing unity where the ancient world offers fragments, he built interpretations that respect complexity. He also made clear why the broad method matters. If a scholar reads only texts, whole classes of ritual action vanish. If a scholar reads only images, the actions lose their social and institutional setting. If a scholar reads only inscriptions, the living practices that gave them meaning remain silent. Jameson's gift was to refuse those losses. Antigone has already been taken away. She is being sealed into a stone chamber while still alive, cut off from light and human company. After the chorus recalls other figures who suffered cruel confinement, the stage changes again. A blind prophet enters, guided by a boy. He does not come with opinions or rumours. He comes with warnings and with the kind of evidence that a king cannot easily ignore. The prophet tells Creon that the city is balanced on a knife's edge. The proof is not political. It is ritual. It begins with the sky. Birds that should be readable as signs have turned chaotic, shrieking without meaning, striking at one another as if nature itself has been thrown out of order. That is the first alarm. Then comes the second, more frightening than the first, a sacrifice that refuses to behave. The altar is prepared, fire is lit, offerings are placed, and yet the flame will not rise as it should. Instead of clean burning, everything turns wrong. Moisture seeps out where it should not. Smoke clings and sputters. Fat fails to catch. The fire looks sick, and the bitter fluid of the animal bursts and scatters, as if the ritual is rejecting the hands that perform it. The prophet explains why. The city has been contaminated by an unburied corpse. Dogs and birds have fed on it, then carried that pollution back into the sacred spaces of everyday life. The consequence is devastating. Prayers no longer land. Sacrifices no longer reach their target. The gods refuse to listen because the city's altars have become unclean. That dramatic moment, a prophet reading a failed sacrifice, seems like pure theatre. But there is a remarkable piece of visual evidence that mirrors it with eerie precision. On an Athenian vase, a sacrifice is shown in progress. Flames rise from an altar. A naked boy holds a double spit with small inner organs roasting above the fire. Another young man carries a tray with offerings. At the centre stands an older, bearded officiant. He is performing a gesture that normally belongs to the exact moment when the group waits for signs from the fire. Yet something is off. This is not the common scene seen again and again in Greek art, where a tail curls up in the heat and everybody watches it for omens. The familiar tail is missing. There is no obvious cup or jug for a pouring libation, and the object held over the flame is not long and curved like a tail. It is small, round, and gripped in a way that suggests pressure, as though the officiant is about to squeeze it. That detail changes everything, because one specific object in a sacrifice fits that shape and that action. The gallbladder. In Greek divination, certain inner parts mattered intensely. The surface of the organs, the look of the liver, the shape and colour of fluids, and the way fat and bones burned were all treated as readable messages. The gallbladder, filled with bitter liquid, belonged to that world. It was not just waste. It could become a sign. Imagine the scene on the vases in motion. The officiant holds the gall bladder over the fire and compresses it. A thin stream of bile falls onto flame and embers. If the ritual is going well, the fire reacts in a controlled, intelligible way. If it goes wrong, the liquid spatters and hisses, smoke thickens. The altar becomes a stage for failure. The group leans in because the message, whatever it is about to appear. The artist emphasizes that attention. Several figures stare toward the altar. The gestures are not casual. This is the tense stillness of people waiting to learn whether the sacrifice has been accepted. But the vase holds one more surprise. The scene is split into two emotional zones. On one side are the active participants, youth and ritual labor around the flames. On the other side is a quieter cluster of older men with staffs, standing and watching. And at the center of that second group sits one figure who feels different. He faces toward the altar, but he does not react like the others. He seems withdrawn, still, sealed inside his own silence. Seen in person, that seated figure reads like someone who cannot see. The body is present, but the gaze is absent. The stillness is not boredom. It is the stillness of blindness among people whose eyes are fixed on a sign in the fire. That observation matters because it turns the vase into something more specific than a generic sacrifice. It begins to look like a dramatic scene. A blind seer cannot perform every step at the altar. Someone else handles the burning parts, someone else squeezes the gallbladder. And the observers describe what happens. The blind seer receives the report, then delivers the interpretation that will shake the ruler. That is exactly how the prophet functions in the tragedy. The seer watches the sky through hearing. Then he tests the gods through sacrifice. When the rite collapses, he understands that the problem is not private, it is civic, it is political, and he walks into the king's presence with a verdict shaped by ritual failure. The vase seems to compress that whole chain of events into a single quiet image. The artist does not show dogs and birds carrying corruption through the city. He does not show the king's panic. He does not show bodies in the palace. He chooses one charged detail. The moment when bile meets fire and the sacrificial system itself begins to say no. Even the composition supports the story. The sighted watch the flame. The blind man waits for others to tell him what the gods have done. The scene holds back on action, but the meaning is loud. Something has gone wrong at the altar, and a ruler is about to hear it. For Greek communities, war did not begin with marching orders. It began with a conversation with the unseen. A campaign was not treated as a purely human decision. It was treated as an action that had to be cleared, step by step, through ritual. Not because everyone expected a guaranteed prophecy of victory, but because moving forward without divine approval was imagined as reckless, even dangerous. This is why Greek writers often used war as the strongest example when talking about other parts of life. If people were careful to seek signs before risking their lives in battle, then surely the same logic applied to farming, travel, politics, and business. War became the model case, the place where ritual looked most intense, most public, and most unavoidable. To see the process clearly, it helps to start with the society that practiced military religion with a reputation for discipline, Sparta. Other cities followed similar patterns, sometimes less rigidly, sometimes with local twists, but the Spartan example lets the whole sequence come into focus. Once a Spartan campaign was approved, the king who would lead it began at home. The first sacrifice happened not on a battlefield, but in his own space, before the army ever crossed a boundary. The goal was simple: test the path ahead. If the signs looked good, the expedition could become real rather than hypothetical. Then came a second threshold, the border of the homeland itself. fire carried from the first altar became a moving bridge between home and the outside world. At the edge of the territory, more offerings were made and signs were checked again. Only then did the army cross into the uncertain space beyond its own land. From that moment onward, the march carried ritual with it, like a shadow. The army did not travel empty-handed. It moved alongside animals meant for sacrifice, especially sheep, practical victims that could survive long distances and rough terrain. These animals were not just provisions. They were part of the army's operating system. When a decision point arrived, ritual was ready. As the army advanced, sacrifices could be performed repeatedly. At the start of a day, before building a fort, before attacking a settlement, before choosing whether to push forward or hold position. Even the rhythm of marching could be shaped by the rhythm of sacrifice. There was also a clear sense of limits. Ritual was frequent, but it was not infinite. The day could only contain so many attempts before the pattern became excessive and the supply of victims ran out. One kind of crossing was treated with special seriousness: water. Rivers, for the Greeks, were not just obstacles, they were powers. Many rivers were imagined as divine beings with their own will, capable of helping or hindering. Even when no specific river god was named, the act of stepping from one bank to another felt like moving through a boundary that belonged to someone. Because of that, crossing water often demanded a different ritual emphasis. Instead of focusing on a shared meal and the ordinary exchange between humans and gods, the rite could concentrate on the moment of bloodletting itself, letting blood flow into water. It was a raw gesture, a stark acknowledgement of the force being confronted. It also produced the kind of sign that could authorize the crossing or forbid it. So the campaign progressed through a chain of ritual checkpoints: home, border, river, sea, camp, approach, battle. At each point, the same question returned in a new form: continue or stop? Then came the most charged moment of all, when the enemy army was visible and near enough that time compressed. In that final stretch, a last sacrifice was made close to the line. It could happen when the distance was short enough that the enemy felt almost within reach. This was not the leisurely ritual of a city altar. This was ritual performed under pressure, in open air, in a place that might become a killing ground in minutes. Immediately after this final rite, the army advanced. The battle song rose. For some forces, music was not decoration but discipline, a sound that could steady movement, regulate pace, and make a line act like a single body. What followed was the brutal reality of close combat. And when the fight ended, if one side held the field, ritual returned again in a different mood. Trophies, thank offerings, victory sacrifices, sometimes contests. Even celebration could be carefully controlled, as if too much triumph might invite envy from gods or humans. That is the outline of what happened. But what did it mean? At the surface level, the purpose seems straightforward. Read the signs, secure permission, avoid offending the powers that mattered. Many modern readers are tempted to admire the seriousness of it all, the way armies could delay action while waiting for favourable indications, and the way some disasters were blamed on ignoring a warning. Yet there is a problem built into the system. In most battles, both sides believed the divine signals were acceptable. Few conflicts ended in a draw. One side usually lost, so the survivors of defeat still had to explain why the gods allowed them to move forward. They had to interpret failure without breaking faith in the method. That kind of tension is common in prediction systems. It does not automatically destroy belief. Instead, it often produces more explanation. Maybe a ritual was incomplete. Maybe another god was offended. Maybe a sign was misunderstood. Maybe arrogance polluted the action. The system survives because it can absorb disappointment and still feel necessary. There is another issue. The ancient sources tend to describe ritual from a social, official angle. They show what the army did as a community, how it maintained its relationship with the city's gods, how it tried to keep the campaign within approved boundaries. What is less visible in plain prose is the darker layer. Fear, death, the sense that the battlefield is a place where violent forces gather. Poetry, however, makes that layer impossible to ignore. In the poetic imagination, war is surrounded by hunger for blood, by destructive presences that feed on the fallen. Fear itself can be imagined as something that receives offerings. Some leaders are even said to have performed rites aimed directly at the terror that accompanies combat. The battlefield is not only strategy and courage. It is also a zone where the mind feels exposed, and where unseen dangers feel close. To understand Greek war ritual, it helps to recognize that not all sacrifice language meant the same thing. Greek ritual vocabulary contained categories that overlap, blur, and sometimes contradict one another because the underlying experiences were not always cleanly separated. One broad category covers rites in general, including normal sacrifice where certain parts are burned and the rest can be eaten. In that kind of sacrifice, a fire matters, an altar matters, and the act often ends in a communal meal. Signs can come from the appearance of organs, from the behavior of the fire, from the way offerings burn, from details that trained specialists interpret. But alongside that broad, everyday sacrificial world sits a sharper type of rite. Its language points straight to the throat-cutting act and to blood. In that mode, an altar fire may be irrelevant, and there is no shared meal from the victim. The emphasis narrows down to killing, to blood flowing, to a concentrated action aimed at a single purpose. This blood-focused rite appears in several contexts: oath ceremonies, some purifications, dealings with the dead or heroic powers, certain emergency moments, and crucially, the final rite before battle, and sometimes the rite used for crossing water. In these settings, the normal give and take feels weaker. The atmosphere is tense, the community is dealing with boundaries, danger, and forces that threaten social order. The ritual becomes less like a feast and more like a controlled strike. In practice, both modes could appear in the same campaign. Normal sacrifices could frame the march and the camp. Blood-focused rites could mark crossings and the final approach to battle. A simple pattern emerges. Normal sacrifice at home and borders. Blood-focused action at water crossings. Normal sacrifice in camp. Blood-focused action at the battle line. Yet the boundary between these modes was not always sharp. Real life forces rituals together. A commander may use a general word for sacrifice while performing the blood-focused rite. Another writer may use the blood-focused term even when the scene looks more like normal sacrifice. Over time, retellings can also blend rituals that were originally distinct, especially when later authors imagined battle line rites as if they were performed at a proper altar with leisurely burning and careful observation. There are scenes where that blurring becomes obvious. A story might describe an army waiting for favourable results, victim after victim, while also picturing burning offerings and altar procedure that would be hard to set up under immediate threat. Another account might treat a battle line rite as if it were a full sacrificial ceremony because that is easier to visualize, even if it does not match what would likely happen under pressure. This matters because it shows something important about how Greek ritual was understood. The rites were not only technical procedures, they were also a language of confidence. When a commander says that the signs are good, whether from earlier sacrifices from birds or from the blood-focused rite at the line, the message is not just information, it is morale. It is permission. It is the feeling that advancing is not a blind gamble. That is why these moments appear repeatedly in narratives. The leader sacrifices at dawn. The omen appears. The army moves. Later, the enemy is sighted. The final rite is performed. The signal is favourable. The line advances. The ritual chain does not replace judgment. It strengthens it. It turns a dangerous human choice into a choice that feels backed by cosmic order. At the same time, ritual also acknowledges that war invites disorder. Crossing borders, crossing water, stepping into the space between two armies, all of these are transitions that feel risky in a sacred sense. Blood-focused rites answer that risk with a deliberate, controlled release of blood, as if to say, the army recognizes the powers here, and it is ready. Greek warfare, then, was not only a contest of spears and shields. It was a procession of thresholds. Home became outside. Land became foreign land. River became barrier. Camp became battlefield. Each step was marked, tested, and authorized through ritual action. The result was a war machine that moved not only by command but by permission, not only by discipline but by signs. In the most intense moments before a Greek battle, something striking happens in the evidence. The ritual is clear, the killing is clear, the demand for signs is clear, yet the name of the divine recipient often disappears. The army performs a blood-focused sacrifice, but the god is left unspoken. Sometimes a text will say only that the victims are prepared for the right powers, as if the audience already knows who those powers must be. In legendary stories, fear itself can become the target. Personified terror is treated as something that can be addressed, as if anxiety were not just an emotion, but a presence hovering over the line. In dramatic tales, the most extreme versions push even further, imagining human victims offered to underworld rulers, or to violent divine forces tied to a city's mythic past. Yet even there, the pattern is inconsistent. The ritual action is emphasized more than the identity behind it. Against this general silence, one historical figure stands out sharply. Artemis, under the title that places her outside the settled world. In Spartan practice, the battle line rite is sometimes linked directly to her. A young goat is slaughtered within sight of the enemy, and the army participates in a highly formal way, crowned with foliage, as if the whole force is entering a charge zone together. That title matters. It points toward uncultivated land, the edges beyond fields and walls. Greek tradition also connected it to hunting, because hunting takes place in the same in-between space. Neither town nor farmland, but the rough ground where rules feel weaker and instincts feel louder. At first glance, hoplite combat looks nothing like chasing hares or stalking deer. But the connection is not about technique. It is about environment and psychology. War, like hunting, pulls men out of ordinary civic order. It places them in exposed territory, surrounded by uncertainty, acting as a band rather than as individual householders. It activates a distinctive emotional climate. Watchfulness, aggression, restraint, panic held down by discipline. Artemis in this aspect is not simply a goddess of animals. She becomes a guardian of human beings, when they are pushed into the wild edge of experience. The goat also fits the symbolism. Among common domestic animals, goats are creatures of rough margins. They thrive where crops struggle, on rocky slopes and scrubland. Choosing a goat as the victim quietly matches the setting where the army imagines itself standing. Outside comfort, outside routine, inside danger. Athens, despite later stereotypes that treated this Artemis as a Spartan specialty, had its own strong relationship with her. Her shrine lay beyond the city walls. in a zone that could be framed as wilderness, in contrast to streets and cultivated plain. A famous vow tied her cult to a moment of national survival, and the city turned that memory into a repeating annual sacrifice. In later periods, armed youths marched in her procession, reinforcing her link to training, readiness, and the passage from boyhood into citizenship. Even the financial traces of her cult keep the military flavour. Money linked to prisoners of war appears in her treasury, and an official connected to war sacrifice performs rites, for her alongside a war god. That raises a question that is hard to settle. Was she merely honoured for one legendary saving moment? Or did she continue to matter in real campaigns in ways that later narratives simply stop mentioning? There are reasons to hesitate. Later accounts of Athenian fighting rarely highlight her in the same way they highlight her in the story of the earlier vow. Visual evidence for battle line slaughter sometimes shows a different victim than a goat. And there is also the geography of Athenian mobilization. The army gathered at the sanctuary of Apollo with a title that evokes the untamed as well. Two shrines, two related divine figures, both tied to the threshold between civic life and the violent world beyond it. It becomes plausible that the famous vow to Artemis was made in a setting where Apollo's military gathering place was central, and that the vow itself functioned like a pledge of future payment. The enemy dead would be balanced by an annual offering of the goddess's favoured animal. Whether she became the routine recipient of the battle line rite is uncertain, but her role as a remembered protector was secured by repetition. All of this returns to the main puzzle. If the rite could be directed to a named divine figure, why are names so often absent, including names that seem obvious candidates? War gods and civic protectors are present in other military contexts, in oaths, in stories, in art. Yet at the battle line, the evidence frequently refuses to label the recipient. One explanation is that armies sometimes aimed the blood toward powers that were not comfortably named, Earth itself receiving the flow in place of an altar, local heroic presences tied to the ground, being fought over, or the shadowy forces imagined to roam battlefields. Another explanation is simpler and may be closer to lived reality. Different commanders, different city traditions, and different emotional states produced different choices. And not every choice was articulated out loud in a way a writer bothered to record. The pattern suggests that, at this instant, the identity mattered less than the action. The act is what tightened the group, what marked the moment, what signalled readiness. In a crisis, ritual language can become minimalist. The blood is released, a sign is taken, courage is gathered, the line moves. This is also why theories that treat the battle line rite, primarily as purification, feel strained. Some purification rites involve carrying a slain victim around a space to cleanse it, and a few scenes and phrases hint that a dead animal or a key part of it could be displayed as proof that the rite was completed. But the usual vocabulary of cleansing is missing from battlefield descriptions, and there is little evidence that the victim is treated like a scapegoat driven outward or sent toward the enemy as a carrier of pollution. What does appear repeatedly, instead, is the idea of the powerful act. The throat is cut, the blood flows, and the meaning is concentrated. If any sacrifice in human imagination could intensify that concentration, it would be human sacrifice. Greek writers knew many stories in which extreme danger triggers an extreme offering. Sometimes the victim is from within the community, often noble, the child of a ruling house. Sometimes the victim is an enemy prisoner, killed with less hesitation. These stories were once treated as a simple narrative of progress, humanity replacing human sacrifice with animal sacrifice, as civilization advanced. But they can be read more sharply as psychological and symbolic constructions. Narratives built to express what a community feels in moments when survival seems to demand an unbearable price. In many of these tales, the offering is not neatly placed into the normal sequence right at the battle line. It hovers over the entire emergency: plague, siege, invasion, collapse. That makes the stories less useful as literal descriptions of standard practice, but very useful as windows into the mental world surrounding war. The internal victim appears in the famous story of a young woman sacrificed, so an army can sail, or so a crisis can be resolved. The immediate ritual logic resembles rites performed for dangerous crossings or hostile winds, yet the narrative often overlays war imagery onto it, blending the boundary-crossing sacrifice with the violence of battle. Tragedy likes these figures because they concentrate emotion: fear, duty, helplessness, consent. Other stories shift the focus to voluntary self-offering, where a person chooses to die because an oracle demands it. These tales can be attached to place names and local identities, turning death into a foundation. The victim becomes a protective presence bound to the land. There are also stories where a desperate city seeks salvation through a noble death, but the act occurs on walls or towers rather than before two armies. Here, the emphasis is not on the mechanics of battle line ritual, but on repayment and ancient anger, as if blood must be returned to the earth to settle a debt embedded in the city's myth. And then come the stories of enemy victims. The prisoner killed as a special offering, not because the army lacks sheep or goats, but because the moment is imagined to deserve a prize given to the gods. In ordinary sacrifice, communities select the finest animal when they want to show honour. In these darker stories, the finest captive becomes that selected prize. The point is not scapegoating so much as prestige, first fruit logic, and the attempt to secure favour or deflect divine jealousy through a spectacular gift. Some famous versions of these stories unravel under scrutiny, tangled in contradictions about when prisoners were captured and which gods supposedly received them. That does not make the stories meaningless. It makes them revealing in a different way. They show what people could imagine as appropriate when the stakes were overwhelming. An offering grand enough to match the danger. When Greek artists depict sacrifice in a military setting, 3 scenes become especially revealing. They do not show altars, incense, families gathered around a feast, or priests arranging instruments on a table. They show one thing: a warrior killing a ram with a sword. In the first image, the action is stripped down to essentials. A helmeted fighter wears no heavy armour, as if he is between moments, not marching, not fully engaged, but already in the zone where combat is about to begin. He grips a ram's muzzle with one hand, pins the animal with his legs, and drives a sword straight through the neck. The ram collapses to its knees. Blood bursts from the wound and spills from the exit of the blade. Nothing else competes for attention. The entire picture is the cut. In a second example, the surviving fragment compresses several realities into a single field of view. The sacrificer straddles the ram, forces the head back by pushing down on a horn, and stabs again with a sword. Nearby, armed men face each other with spears, already arranged like opponents. Below, a corpse is being dragged away, while a young figure reacts in grief. Here, sacrifice, battle, and death are not separate themes. They are one story told in different registers, like rapid flashes before impact. A third image, carved in relief far from Athens, yet made in a thoroughly Greek style, repeats the same core gesture. A kneeling, helmeted man clamps the ram's neck between his thighs, yanks the head back, and raises a sword for the killing stroke. Beside him stands an older bearded figure, armoured and authoritative, holding a shield and lifting his arm in a gesture that reads like appeal or prayer. This is not a calm religious gathering, it is command, tension, and preparation for violence. Two of these works lean openly toward heroic battle imagery. The first is even more unsettling because it has no narrative frame at all. It isolates the killing as if the killing itself is the message. And that message becomes clearer when one compares these scenes with the common Greek depictions of sacrifice. Normally, Greek art prefers the ritual's orderly middle, a victim being led, a libation being poured, attendants carrying baskets and knives, flames licking at an altar, and the promise of a communal meal. The actual moment of slaughter is usually avoided. When Greek artists do show throat cutting, it tends to be reserved for exceptional scenes, especially those involving human victims. That tells you something about taste, restraint, and what was considered fit to display. Yet in these military scenes, the taboo breaks, the blade enters, the blood appears, the victim is pinned like an opponent. And crucially, the killing is done with a soldier's sword, not a specialist knife. The killer wears a helmet. He belongs to the fighting group. Even if a seer is present in real life, the image refuses to separate ritual from warfare. The same hand that kills the animal will soon kill a man. Nothing in these pictures suggests a feast. There is no altar, no fire, no division of meat, no orderly line of attendants. There is also no symbol to identify a specific god receiving the act. The emphasis is not on the named recipient, but on the act itself. At this moment, the ritual is not a social gathering. It is a threshold. That visual choice supports a broader pattern visible across Greek warfare rituals. As armies moved toward conflict, the meaning of religious action became narrower. Early in a campaign, rites could be expansive. Repeated offerings, careful attention to signs, prayers, and rituals tied to borders, rivers, or departure. These stages still resemble normal civic religion. They look like the city speaking to the divine world. But as the two lines close, everything non-essential falls away. Even divination, which remains present, begins to fuse with action. The rite becomes a concentrated expression of intent. The animal is killed immediately before men begin killing each other. The sacrifice does not merely ask a question, it states a desire. Stories about remarkable wartime sacrifices suggest the kinds of meanings Greeks could attach to these moments. Some tales frame sacrifice as giving up something precious so the community might survive. Others treat it as offering a first prize to the powers above, a dramatic gift meant to secure favour. Still others imagine dangerous forces near the battlefield that must be acknowledged, appeased, or pushed back. Whether those interpretations were consciously present for every historical soldier is hard to prove. But the direction of the ritual is clear. As violence approaches, the ritual grows more blunt. This also explains something that puzzles modern readers. Armies sometimes sacrificed repeatedly until they received the signs they needed. That practice can look like deep obedience to divine instruction, but it can also look like determination. If the decision to fight was firm, sacrifices continued until permission appeared or until circumstances made waiting impossible. Religious life and practical realities were not separate lanes. They were intertwined so tightly that trying to separate sincere belief from strategic calculation misses how the system functioned. At the very last instant, the battle line sacrifice collapses meanings into a single stroke. It is not softened by the familiar forms of a civic feast. It is not dressed up as a gentle image of community. It is a ritual beginning to slaughter, anticipating slaughter, and psychologically preparing men for slaughter. the animal's throat stands in for what is about to happen to human bodies. Some modern observers have argued that such rites have a persuasive dimension, almost like ritualized pressure applied to reality. The sacrifice becomes an action that embodies the desired outcome. Not because the participants are naive, but because expressive actions help people cope with unbearable uncertainty. When men stand on the edge of hand-to-hand combat, they reach for concentrated rituals that compress fear, hope, and resolve into one controllable moment. The killing is both symbol and rehearsal. It says, without needing words, what the group wants to be true. That is why these images include no clear divine emblem. They do not pause to name a god. They do not stop to show the community eating together. They show the only thing that matters in that instant. A controlled killing that must immediately be followed by uncontrolled killing. Now compare that stark battlefield logic with the ritual imagery placed at the entrance to Athens' most sacred space. A small temple dedicated to victory was rebuilt and adorned with sculpture that became famous for its elegance. Winged figures move with impossible grace. Drapery clings and flows like water in wind. At first glance, the scenes can feel decorative, almost like choreography. But the central action is not decorative at all. At the most visible side, a winged victory kneels on a large bovine victim and lifts a sword for the throat. This is not the usual calm sacrifice of civic life. The chosen instant is the violent instant. It is the same kind of battlefield killing seen in the Veii scenes, translated into public monumental art. That choice matters. A victory celebration after battle normally implies feast, fellowship, and human presence. Here, mortals are absent. The gods and their winged agents perform everything. The sacrifice is not shown as a communal banquet. It is shown as a decisive act that frames the entire logic of war. The surrounding imagery reinforces it. War trophies stand nearby, the traditional markers raised at the end of fighting. The sculpture compresses time. It shows the beginning and the end at once, the violent rite that precedes battle and the trophy that follows victory. The sequence is telescoped into a single program. It is not a documentary record of what literally happens at one moment. It is a statement of what Athens wants to believe about itself. This also explains why the victims feel ambiguous. The imagery avoids making the sacrifice look like a normal offering to the goddess in charge of the site. The animals are not framed as her standard, familiar victims. The point is not ordinary worship. The point is the kind of killing that belongs to war. And that produces the real shock of the monument. The style is light, sensuous, and refined, but the message is blunt. Under the gaze of the city's goddess, victory does not simply crown the winners, she kills. The act promises that the Athenians will win because the ritual beginning of battle is already performed in the sacred heart of the city. This is not realism, it is ideology made beautiful. The sculpture does not ask you to think carefully about logistics or chronology. It asks you to feel inevitability. It insists that divine power and civic ambition align, that the city is protected, and that success is guaranteed. Whether that confidence matched reality is another question, but the combination is revealing, exquisite artistic control paired with a ritual of controlled brutality. The Athenians could imagine themselves as both refined and dominant, both graceful and unstoppable. In stone, at the entrance to the Acropolis, that self-image becomes permanent. Victory as a dance and victory as a cut.